Okay, let's go back to the beginning. Let's go back to your kind of origin story. How did you get into science fiction and fantasy? Did you read it as a kid growing up?
I got into it with The Hobbit was my gateway novel, and I remember we had moved in third grade to another county. It was still, relatively close, but one of my friends that I met there recommended the Hobbit, and so we had a small school library, and so I checked that out, and then immediately jumped to the Lord of the Rings. And I remember, I'd read a fair number of books. I wasn't a huge avid reader, I suppose, before that point, but I loved the world so much, and seeing it through a hobbit's eyes, being a hobbit in that world essentially as I'm reading, and it was transportive. It was it made me fall in love with fantasy. So that The Hobbit was my gateway novel. I went on to read, mostly fantasy for quite some time into junior high and high school, and then sort of branched out into science fiction as well. That was my entree into this world.
I think I did the same. I predominantly read fantasy to begin with. So, Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, Terry Brooks,
Same.
Eddings, all this kind of stuff into my teens.
Yep.
And it wasn't until I think I hit 15 that I started getting into sci-fi. I mean, I was watching it, your Star Treks and your Star Wars. I've been watching them from, the very beginning pretty much. But it wasn't until I sort of hit maybe teenage years and suddenly thought, okay, I'll try some Asimov, or I'll try a bit of Clark or something. I don't know why. I don't know why I didn't think about reading it before then, but I didn't feel the urge.
Yeah, I very similar story. Trying to remember the first, how I got into it. It might have been actually Piers Anthony. I developed other friends as time went on, and one of my friends was reading the Split Infinity series.
Right. I'm not sure.
I think I might have been is it the Blue Adept? There was a trilogy in which somebody from like a science fiction world traveled to this magical world and sort of learned how to master magic, and then he had to use that in both worlds simultaneously, which is where that split infinity idea came from. And so, that was kind of an easy entree into science fiction. And then I gravitated fairly quickly to kind of serious tones, even dark tones. So Stephen Donaldson jumps to mind.
Right.
The Thomas Covenant series.
Yeah.
And then I eventually, so I did read some of his sci-fi, The Gap Cycle. And then also C.S. Friedman wrote one of my top three series of all time, the Coldfire trilogy, which actually has some science fiction underpinnings as well. It's largely fantastic, but the story stems from a generation ship that goes and is forced to alter course before they reach their actual destination. There's some problem on the ship, and they go and they land on this world that has a balanced world. It has this Gaia effect. Everything is in balance. This sort of magical force that's on this world, and humans throw it all out of whack. So when the story starts, you have characters who are, they have nightmares, and those nightmares come to life. The world sort of makes them real.
Wow.
And so then it's a survival story, like, will this group of people survive on this planet or not? And they do, but to do so, they sort of give up, they sacrifice their heritage, the technology that they have, and sort of embrace the world. And so again, it's this mixture of science fiction. It's fantasy forward, and then you have sort of these science fictional underpinnings. And then I eventually read some of her other science fiction work. In Conquest Born was just a brilliant novel. I love that one. And a few others of hers. And so yeah, I did start getting into science fiction, and I just in general, I'm not writing and reading style. I tend towards sort of more serious, dark tones. And in fact, I have to work a little bit, I think, at adding humor, making
Right.
it light, even if it's, and I'm still working on this. I'm not great at it. Gallows humor, I think, can work very effectively. Joe Abercrombie
Mm.
jumps to mind, when this kind of thing comes up. Plenty of others, Glenn Cook as well. Um, just adding a little bit of lightness, to the darkness can do wonders to make the darkness actually more effective, right? Because otherwise it gets not only too dark but too monotone. The variation, just the tone doesn't change enough to keep the reader interested.
So it sounds like all of these things were you picking them up as you were going along, even at that age? Were you thinking about story beyond what was on the page and thinking, maybe I should do that one day?
No, not in the from the perspective of becoming a writer. Although I did dabble, but I never, in say late high school, I kind of started a few stories. Mostly it's like assignments, part of assignments for different classes. And then towards the end of college, like my third or fourth year, I started seriously trying to write a novel, and that of course was a trunk novel. I mean, it was a terrible derivative story, and I never even finished it.
Right.
But I enjoyed kind of getting my feet wet a little bit. But, back in the earlier days when I was reading and getting into fantasy and sci-fi, it was more from a gaming perspective.
Right.
I started playing D&D very early. I guess junior high was when I started in earnest, and then through high school, and in fact I still meet with my high school gaming gang, and I eventually tried my hand at game mastering, DMing, dungeon mastering, and so so those stories obviously affected me there, and that started to develop my love of creating worlds, creating situations, creating characters, and then leading the groups through those things. And they were definitely story oriented, but I am a huge fan of like world building, and making like unique worlds and unique situations, and so that was kind of the birth of that joy. Yeah.
I started role playing probably late teens as well, and then a friend of mine developed his own system, and we played that instead because he built it on his own fantasy world. So it's sort of, and that worked really well. And I hadn't played for years. Then we just kind of got back into it. And people say, "Oh, do you want to be the GM or DM?" And I'm always like, no, because it feels too much like work, like making up stories and worlds and ideas. I'm like, yeah, but I do that for my writing job. I'm like, I don't want to do that. I just want to write. I'm going to go over there, and they're like, well, that's not part of the story. Well, I'm going to go over there and do stuff and see what happens. And they're like, oh, and I just, I love that kind of randomness that I can go and do this. I don't like having to think up the stuff. I'm like, no, I do that anyway. I don't want to do it again. Are you a player then, or do you GM now?
I am mostly a player now. It does take a lot of effort to craft the worlds, and with still a fairly young family, and the writing day job, I don't know that it would interfere so much. I just have trouble finding the time, frankly, to do it. I really enjoyed doing that stuff, and I'm sure I would still enjoy it. Just a matter of carving out the time. I don't feel like I would do the game justice if I can't really dedicate a whole bunch of time. It's not just like the upfront work of developing the say the world, and and sort of the general campaign they might go through. It's it's a constant amount of upkeep, because you have to sort of keep that fresh, and the characters might take different directions than you expected they were going to, that sort of thing. So you really have to put in a good amount of effort, and plus just preparing for like the next session that comes up, even if it's like bi-weekly. There's a good amount to make sure you have any maps in place, and measure they find, or whatever.
It's a lot of work. It's a lot of work on top of everything else that you're trying to do, and write books and stuff. Like you, I don't have the time, but I'm happy to be a player for someone else to do all of that work, and me just turn up and hit people with my sword and wander around. That's that's what I love to do. So when did you start seriously writing books and think, this is something that I want to do? And when did you start trying to get published? Because I've got loads of trunk novels that I I'd send off and get rejected, and I'd do another one, send off and get rejected.
Yeah.
Did you get into that kind of cycle for a while?
Yeah, a bit. So I did that book that I mentioned, like in college time frame, and then I took a break for a while, and then I guess it was like early 30s roughly when I was I think I kind of started something new and I dabbled with it for years, and I was like, I either have to dedicate some real time to this or just give it up, because it was taking a large amount of time, and it was one of these cases where then I didn't write super often, and so when I wrote, I had to sort of review where I was, and then
Right.
and kind of reimagine. It's difficult. That's why I often tell people, it's good, at least for me anyway, to write every day, something every day once you're in a project, because that if you wait, your mind will sort of offload that from main memory, right? And you have to like reload everything into RAM, once you get started again, and that takes time, and it becomes sort of inefficient. I feel the story gets really choppy if you have these large segments between writing sessions. So I decided, I wanted to get more serious. I was living in California at the time, in Orange County, which is just south of LA,
Right.
along the ocean. And I found some conventions to go to. I've been going to Gen Con, which is a gaming convention. They have I don't know if they still have it. They had a Gen Con in Europe. They had one in SoCal.
Right.
But I had been going to the original started in Wisconsin, where I live. Lake Geneva, which is where the Gen comes from, was where it started. It moved to Parkside University in my hometown, and so it was bikeable for me when I was like 12. So I would just go there every year and check it out, and I loved it. I loved that convention. It was so awesome. I loved the university itself. It was a kind of maze-like, kind of a sprawling university, and so it was just fun to sort of wander the halls and go to the sellers area with all the dice and figures and paints and games and all that kind of stuff, and go to the auction. They have this auction every year where they sell old games, and so you can go and bid on stuff, and it was just fun to look at that. And so it eventually moved to Milwaukee, and then might have had it before, but they had a writer's track, and so some people that started to influence me in terms of like teaching, Kiz Johnson, Mike Stackpole, Gene Raby. I started to go to some of their seminars each year, and then I went to some local conventions in California. I got more serious about going to conferences instead of conventions. So conferences are a bit more craft oriented.
Yeah.
And so I went to a few of those, and then eventually I kind of graduated to workshops. So I went to Viable Paradise, Orson Scott Card's Literary Boot Camp, and then Clarion, and then I ran a couple of workshops. I called it Wellspring. It was a Wellspring writing workshop, which was based off of Charlie Finley's Blue Heaven style. So it was a novel writing workshop.
Right.
And so roughly 12 people would critique each other's like first 50 pages, and then you'd get a few full reviews of your full novel, and vice versa. You would read a couple of fulls, as you were there. And those are very valuable as well. So, I was kind of on the workshop cycle. I did one per year for a number of years. Wow. And during that time, I was continuing I finished that first novel, or a new first novel. And then, so I think I had, let's call it 4 trunk novels before finally getting a nibble on The Winds of Calicovo from Nightshade Books. And so yeah, it was, I don't know how to describe it. I mean, it felt like a very, very stepwise type approach for me. I wasn't terribly gifted at writing in the beginning. I'm still learning. I feel like it's a craft that takes a lifetime to master, type of thing. You're always trying new things. But it was slow market progress, because I'm very dogged when I come to this type of thing, and I enjoy it, so that's part of it as well. And so eventually, after several trunk novels, got that first nibble. I actually got an offer before I had an agent.
Really? Interesting.
Yeah, I for people out there who are or in the boat I was in, so I didn't have an agent, and most publishers will not accept unsolicited manuscripts.
Mm.
But if you go to a convention, writing convention of some sort, you can talk to an editor at coffee at the bar, around the selling floor, and just chat them up a little bit and say, hey, I have this thing I think you might like. So I did that with Jeremy Lassen, who was one of the two co-founders of Nightshade. And I told him about the Winds of Kalikovo, and he's like, oh, okay. Do you have an agent? Was his first question. And I'm like, no, I don't. And he's like, oh, well, it sounds cool. Send it to me anyway. So now it is solicited, right? So you can send that in. So yeah, I got the offer, and then I said, well, give me kind of a few weeks just to try to, talk to an agent. And I eventually landed with Russ Galen of Scoville Galen and Gosh, and he's been great. Very, very pleased that, things worked out with him. Yeah, so that was, the short story of my first sale.
It sounds in some ways, apart from the end bit, the dogged approach, and the same as me, trying about getting rejected, going to conventions, learning, talking to editors, talking to other authors, and just attending as many of those as I can, and constantly getting better. I think with every book, a little better. You get a nibble, and you think, okay, maybe there's something there, and I'll just keep trying. And yeah, I don't think I was particularly talented. Like some people just land it on their first book. There's something so innate that they just hit out the gate, and I didn't that first 5, 6, 7 times where it was. I just had to keep pushing through. And
I mean, it's a process. And even some of the people that land well with their first book, I mean, sometimes it's just because it's a cool idea or whatever. But if you look at them, they had some kind of journey that to them, I'm sure, felt quite long, and to other people looks quite short. They look like overnight successes, right? Mm-hmm. It's one of the more common phrases, like, it took me 15 years to become an overnight success, or whatever. I often think of Pat Rothfuss, who's a uniquely gifted writer. And The Name of the Wind, went wild, and did crazy well with it. And I don't know how much he wrote. I mean, I know he was in Writers of the Future, so he had done like kind of a short story that I think was part of that world, that eventually expanded. And then the actual Kingkiller trilogy he had written fully years ago before actually getting the deal, and then he was sort of rewriting things over time. And so even though his first book was an overnight success, that set of books had been written and rewritten many times before it actually got to the street. And so it's these journeys are often quite long, even if they seem short to some people.
Yeah. Overnight success, 10 years, 15 years in the making. Like, someone will go, oh, is this your debut? Like, no, have you got loads of other books out? God, this is brilliant. I'm getting a little bit of that now. They're like, oh, this is really good. This is the first book. Like, no, it's my 7th. Oh, okay, I'll go back and read your other stuff. Okay, yes.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting thing. Like, well, so one thing I'll mention is like a common saying is, we fight to get published, and then we fight to stay published. Those are the two states of writing. Mm-hmm. And we're always trying to build our audience, and so most of us have kind of some group of fans, and we're always going to be trying to expand beyond that, and it's it's a challenge. It can be frustrating sometimes, but it's kind of exciting too, like to know that you're reaching new folks and they might go back and look at your back catalog. And I remember talking at Gen Con with Margaret Weiss of Weiss and Hickman fame, and she was I was kind of, at the time, I was sort of leaning towards trying to do the writing thing, and hadn't yet sold my first novel or anything. And I can't remember how it came up exactly. I might have asked, how long did it take to become a full-time writer? When can you break away? And she's like, well, often it's not until, beyond 6 books. So that's like, seventh, eighth, ninth, 10th book, that you now have this back catalog working for you that's producing some money along the way as you're working on, new things and stuff.
Yeah.
And that's about where I'm reaching at this point. Even though I made the leap a little bit before that, it's stressful, because it is a business too, right? I'm using this as my primary source of income at this point, so it's challenging, it's exciting, but it's scary, because I have a family depending on this, as well. So it's a weird mix of emotions when it comes to like looking at writing as a career.
Yeah. And I think one misconception is that being a writer means that you can do it full time, and the majority of us have full or part-time jobs alongside the writing, because it isn't sufficient to support a full-time career. And those who can are very, very lucky, but they're the kind of minority out of the hundreds and thousands of that can do it. Like I think of most of my friends who are writers, and I can't think of any that do it full time. Unless other circumstances allow them to do it, or their partner has a good income that's able to support both of them, and they're as additional income, because it's just as you say, we fight to stay published once we're going, and keep producing work.
I may have still been I was in the IT world for a long time. I went to college for computer science and engineering in Milwaukee, and I worked at a nuclear power plant for a while. I worked for IBM for many years, and a smaller software company that got absorbed into IBM, which is how I became a part of them. But I was so nervous about making the leap that I really couldn't have for many years. But towards the end of my IBM career, we got let notice a number of my teammates, and really IBM does this several times, once a year, once every couple of years, they have a sort of a restructuring. They sort of look at their portfolio of software and figure out what's doing well, what isn't doing well. And our segment was contracting, and there were several competitors that were just doing a better job. Our base software was long in the tooth, difficult to install, difficult to customize. And so I got notified that I was going to be let go. And I actually give them credit for this. They said, instead of giving you a severance package right now, we're going to keep you on the payroll for 6 months.
Right.
The idea being that you can either look for a job within IBM or look for a job elsewhere, because it's easier to get a job if you have a job than if you don't have a job. It just looks better in the interview process. And so, during that time, I talked to a number of other people that had made that kind of leap, and they had a additional package beyond those 6 months. And I thought, how often would I get this opportunity? Like, I would find it very difficult to actually give my notice. But if they're telling me it's time to go, right? Maybe I should just kind of take that as a sign and give it a shot. And so that there was some security blanket type stuff that they provided, and then also the one, I probably could not have done it if in the U.S. here, Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, wasn't in place, because there was no way, impossible, to pay for health insurance on like a writer's salary, at least what I predicted my salary would be. So with a lower income, that helps provide some of the health insurance that we're paying for. And we also downsized our house too. We moved from another part of this county to the house we're in now, which is just a right-sized house for us. The other one was a little bit too big, too much upkeep. So so that all provided a way for us to be here and to live, and then to dive into writing full time. And so it's been 4 years at this point that have been like this, and it's been working. It's again, it's constantly challenging. It's constantly worrying, because you don't know how well your books are going to do, and so you're kind of betting that things will sort of continue, or that you'll have, enough of a cushion, in some of the um, higher earning years, to be ready for the lean years.
Yeah.
And I had a decent, nest egg from IBM work too. So we're okay, but it's, it's definitely nervous making.
Yeah, it certainly is. Constantly keeping an eye on things.
Yeah.
So tell me about Song of the Shattered Sands. Where did this come from? Where did this idea grow from? Because there's so many moving parts to it. There's so much going on. So can you trace what, like, some of the seeds of the ideas that then developed into this?
Yeah, for sure, a bit. I mean, just so the milieu is like an Arabian Night style, massive desert with one large population center in the middle of that desert called Sharkai. And so I had been wanting to write like a desert-based fantasy for a while. And in the end of the Winds of Kalakova, the Lays of Anaskaya series, they move from these islands, these archipelagos, onto the mainland where this empire sits. And to the south of the main empire is a desert, stony, rocky expanse. And so that's where I sort of first dabbled with it. But the main story was kind of not there. It was not set there. So I just touched on it a bit. And then I wrote a novella called From the Spices of Sanandira, which is where I sort of created the stand ships. There's these ships that have skimwood skis that can like glide like glass over silk over the sand. And Sanandira itself was this large city in the middle of the desert. And so as I started developing the new ideas for Sharkai and the Song of the Shattered Sands, that was definitely an inspiration. I mean, I kind of reimagined that whole thing, and it blew up. And in terms of like the seeds of the story, like I knew I wanted a female main character. I don't remember if I even knew what she was called at the time, but it was Cheta. I think I knew that she was an orphan. She will have lost her mother. She never knew her father. But the main seed that I recall is like, and I use Pinterest a lot for idea generation.
Right.
I sort of found for like desert-based scenes. I use it for lots of other purposes as well, but just inspiration-wise, I'll look for artwork. A lot of times fantasy artwork, sometimes architectural stuff or actual landscapes in our world. And I stumbled across sort of a zombie mummy ghoul type piece, desert-based piece, so I knew I wanted something like that, some creature like that, and I had this vision of them coming, like stealing into the city at night and like killing people, taking tribute, and I had no idea why. I didn't know what they were about. I don't know who controlled them, if anybody. And so that developed into the Asirim, which are cursed creatures in the Sharkai universe, and they in fact steal into the city once per month when the twin moons are full, and then I needed like rationale, like why are they doing this, and so the other part of, say, this triangle, Cheta is one part, the Asirim are a second part. The third part are the kings themselves. The kings, there are 12. They have ruled the desert for 400 plus years with an iron fist. They are apparently immortal.
Yes.
There are wrinkles to that as the story progresses, but they ended up killing Cheta's mother. So that part of the triangle is now connected.
Yep.
They also control the Asirim, connecting another part of that triangle. The last piece that I had no idea, and this came as a revelation when I finally stumbled across it. Cheta does not understand her heritage.
Right.
Because her mother died, she never really learned, but she knew her mother came from the desert. But which tribe, she doesn't know. There are 12 tribes, just like there are 12 kings. And eventually she learns more about that, her people, and how those people are related to the Asirim, connecting the third part of that triangle. And so without really meaning to, those three things became the exact center of the story. Everything revolved around that. Especially how the kings gained that power in the first place. They made, as we find out relatively early, a bargain with the desert gods 400 years ago when the city was under siege. The city was going to be destroyed by the 12 tribes. And they made a bargain with the gods to secure the city. And as part of that bargain, they were given control over the Asurim, these holy avengers, as the kings call them. But in fact, they are cursed creatures, and they are pitiful in some ways. And so Cheta starts to learn who they are, how they became indebted to the kings, and this opens the grand arc of the story. What's happening behind the scenes is something that characters don't understand in the beginning. They get only bare hints of it in the first couple of books, is what the gods are up to. The gods have a plan as well, as do the kings, as does Cheta, as do other players in this set of novels. And so those are the initial seeds. Those are the things that I remember sort of developing early on in the story that helped keep me grounded, keep me focused on where things were headed and where I needed to go as the story was progressing. And so it felt like at the time, and still does feel like a good core, for not just one novel, but a full series.
With so many parts and so much kind of world building going on, I mean, there's a bunch of stuff you haven't even touched on yet. As you said, there's other characters you haven't spoken about, but there's different types of magic in the world as well. I mean, how I plan my novels, and I'm surely you must do with yours for 6-book series. Yeah. How detailed is your planning? Did you break it down into the 6 books and then break that down into sort of, or did you sort of plan the arcs and then sort of see naturally where they broke into the story, the books, as it were?
Yeah. So I initially kind of knew where things were headed before I started the first page. I knew where the story was going to end, not with any great degree of accuracy. I didn't know how they were going to reach that place, but I knew where they were headed. So it was like a stake in the ground, in the distance somewhere. And then I did sort of develop very rough ideas of where each of the books was going to end. I wouldn't even say I put them in that sort of form. I just knew kind of the progression that had to happen for Cheta to evolve as a hero, and for her allies and friends to reach the same place that the gods were heading towards, with a greater understanding of what they were trying to do and more abilities to stop them. And so in terms of how much I planned, so when I first started writing my first few trunk novels, I would just start writing and fill in the world as I went along. It didn't work for me. Part of the reason those became trunk novels was because the world and so the characters who live in that world were just underdeveloped. And so a lot of it was sort of parroting, things that I enjoyed when I was young, which I think we all fall into to some degree in our first few novels. Part of it was just not knowing the craft very well, but part of it was just not knowing enough about how the world worked and its history. And so I spend a lot more time on that now than I used to. I take years at this point to develop what the world looks like. So even now, I'm developing a couple of series that I know I'm not going to be writing, for a couple of years minimum.
Yeah.
So it's not like I'm working on them full time for a couple of years. What I'm saying is I do what I do. I collect, Pinterest things and read up on stuff, investigate, imagine, and start to develop those over time. So that by the time I'm ready to really start digging in, I know what the world is like. I know what the magic system or technology is like. I have a rough idea of what the main characters are like and what the opposition is trying to do. My favorite kind of stories, just opening up the kimono a little bit for like how I write. I want a world that is on the brink of change. And I like environmental type stuff. I like environmental like magic and effects. And I'll just throw a nod again to Celia Friedman with the Coldfire trilogy and that world that was definitely part of the story. The whole world itself was sort of trying to excise humanity, and humanity had to find a way to live in that kind of world. I love that kind of stuff. And so Lays of Anaskaya was in that vein. The world was changing, and Sharakai too. So Sharakai is in this state where it's been 400 years since the gods made that pact with the kings, and now things are about to bear fruit. The seeds that they planted are about to ripen, and so so that's kind of like how I like to get the underpinnings of the story before I start writing. I want to feel sort of comfortable with what things look like, and then the actual plot becomes so much easier because I kind of know where things stand, and where I liken it to like a rock slide. Like there are rocks sort of hanging on the side of this hill, and all it takes is a couple of pebbles to start the landslide rolling, right?
Yeah.
And so those are the inciting incidents for the story. Just a couple of knocked pebbles and things start to rumble, and then they really start to roll, and so the writing part of it follows. It's still a struggle, of course, but it's way easier than it was when I was just trying to like plow through plot and world and character all at once.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's kind of how I do things. And so I will plot the first book out, and I do similar things as I do for the series. I'll have the ending in mind, a stake in the ground. I'll have a couple of major like turning points, and then I do what I call inchworming my way through the plot. I can only, as when I first started writing, I thought I would be very, very detail oriented, very plan oriented. I thought I'd have these really long outlines, and then I would just write to them essentially.
Yeah.
But I can't. I still can't. I just cannot envision what's going to happen with the characters beyond a little ways ahead. George Martin calls this lights in the fog. He apparently writes like this. He has these major points, and those are bright lights in the fog, and he does not know how he's going to get there, but he knows where he's going. And so as he steps forward, you can see like stepping stones and little pads of earth, in this swamp. And so you get, to this place. Oh, no, I can't go this way. I have to turn over this way, right? And then get to the next one. So I plot about like 6 chapters out, roughly.
Right.
And those are fairly detailed. And beyond that, all I have is the lights in the fog. So I'll write. And then once here's one thing that I've gotten very good at as well. I used to, sometimes I would get to a stopping point and I would think, oh, I need word count. I have to write, a certain amount per day or I'm failing as an author. And so I would just plow forward. I would just continue. And that would often lead to some pretty poor choices. And so it led to either failed stories or just wasted words. Like I would just keep going and I would be like, oh, I have to throw these 5 chapters away because it really started to go bad here or something like that. So anyway, so now as I'm writing and I feel like I'm uncomfortable, like I don't know why they're doing this or where they're going to go next, I just stop and I take a day or two and I reimagine, I plot out again, and then I start writing again. So I kind of, inchworm my way. I write stepwise through the plot until I'm done, and then start the editing process.
I have that as well with the future projects, but they always on the surface feel like they're more appealing. Like, oh, you're working on something and there's this really shiny bauble in the distance going,
yeah.
Well, what about this great idea? And the fight for me is thinking about it, but not letting it stop me from what I'm doing. So I let it kind of build up in the back of my brain, all the bits and pieces that are gathering. Like I guess we call it candles, but cotton candy, in America, where it starts off and it's just a tiny little thread, and you think
candy floss.
That's nothing, and it goes round and round, and then suddenly this big thing. I let it go around in my head like that, gathering up, to get to the point where I go right, and then I exercise it all onto the page, get it all out of my head, and then I carry on with my current project, and it starts to build up again, and that's how, like you. So I'm currently writing a series. But I'm already planning the one after that, and it's ticking over in my brain now. Characters and who are they? Where do they come from? And what are the back history? And what's the world like? And it's percolating, like
Yeah.
It's that shiny bauble thing of it. My brain tricks me into believing that is more interesting than what.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. I mean, that's a constant danger. I guess I fall into that a little bit, but I have we're doing as a small aside, but related. We're doing a kitchen remodel right now, so we're looking for just new kitchen cabinets, countertop, and we got some appliances and stuff. And there's so many choices to make in terms of the color of the cabinets, the species of wood, the paint, the color of paint, the matching paint, the hardware that goes inside of it, the countertop color, on and on and on. And there's so many choices for any of those things, and then like backsplash and I have this like discomfort when a project is unfinished, and so I can't get back to writing until I get this to a certain point. There's a certain point where we have to order some of the cabinets, and wood is at not just a premium, but it's all the home improvement people at this point, at least in the US, are slammed because everyone has been home and they want to like renovate their home because of the pandemic.
Yeah, no one's been on holiday. Everybody's decorating the house.
yeah,
everybody.
Exactly. And so people want to put their money into their house and enjoy it more and that sort of thing. So there's like a 3 month to 4 month, 5 month lead time on cabinets to get them built. But so I need to get this thing to the point where so they're ordered, and then I have a bunch of free time after that. And writing is the same for me. Like I do get these ideas, and I'll I jot them down. I'll make a new Pinterest board. I'll start throwing some images in there. I'll maybe start a new Scrivener document and then throw some plot ideas or character ideas or whatever. But I hate having something unfinished. I can't stand it. And so I get back to the books fairly quickly. When I start a book, I'm just like I churn until I get the first draft done. And then often it's good to set a draft aside after you're done with it, just so you can kind of forget and come back to it with a first reader's eye. So I'll work on some other smaller projects, that type of thing, and then come back to it. But it's probably a good trait in this respect, just to be like totally uncomfortable with unfinished projects.
Definitely, yeah. Can we talk a little about the magic systems in the world of Sharakai?
Yeah, sure.
There's lots of different. So when I've spoken to some authors, they say they want magic to be weird. They don't want to know too much themselves. They don't spend a lot of time on the world building because they want it to be unpredictable and wild and weird. And they feel like if they spent too much time building it, then on a page it comes across as too kind of scientific. Or do you build it so the ins and outs? Some people prefer the mystery, some people prefer structure it. So you've got different kinds of magic without spoiling anything. You have different magic systems in your world. So how did you build them or not?
I mean, I can see the advantages of both. Brandon Sanderson talks about this a fair bit because I won't say prefers, but he has written a number of books that have pretty detailed rules around how the magic works, to the point that they're bordering on like science fictional type stuff. Like the sort of metallurgy based magic in like
Mistborn
series.
Yeah.
That's one example. And so on the one hand, so he has this, I forget if it's Brandon's Law. He has a number of these, and he teaches at BYU in Utah. And so there's a spectrum for any given magic system. The more unknowable the rules are, the more mystical it feels, which a Tolkien-esque type of feel. Ancient magics can often like feel like this. So there's a certain advantage to that from the reader's perspective. But then on the flip side, the more you know about it, yes, the more sort of science fictional it feels, the more like technology it feels. But the more able the characters are to hack those rules, to understand them and master them to the point that they can use them to some other effect, and so now the characters seem a bit more clever. And you could make them seem with the other type of magic. If it's totally unknowable, you can't even describe it in some ways. You can describe the feel of it, I suppose, but not really how it works. And so I like both. I like, I was definitely of the mystical sort of feel in the beginning, but the more I write, the more I want to have at least some structure around it, so that people can understand it, and the characters can leverage it, in some unique way, and it becomes part of the story. You can have the story that drive story, or the story drive the magical change, and that becomes interesting and cool. So in the Sharakai universe, there is a few different types. I mean, the gods have magic, and it's they don't have like spells per se, and they are not all powerful. And in fact, the gods that we meet are young gods, they're called in the book. There are elder gods who created the world and then eventually left, and the young gods pine for them. They miss the old gods because they were their creators, and so they even became a bit angry, resentful, in fact, of humans, mortals who were given the blood of the first gods where they weren't. And so mortals can move on to the next world and visit the old gods, and the young gods cannot. They are trapped. They are part of this world, and that becomes part of the story eventually. And so so there's this sort of do what you want when you want sort of thing with the young gods, because they are gods. And then there's blood magic in the world, which is a bit more rule based. I'm going to give credit to, because I love this story, Ted Chiang wrote The Story of Your Life, that became the movie. I'm going to forget the movie name. I forget it. But in it, the aliens that come and visit Earth, and there's a linguist who gets pulled into helping to decipher the alien language.
Yeah.
And over time, what she finds are there are different symbologies that are like overlaid over one another. So you might have one symbol for ball, and red is another symbol that gets laid on top of it. And so now you have a single symbol for red ball. Flies is yet another. So red ball flies, and they do it all in one symbol. And as she comes to understand this, time starts to become unlocked, and it becomes clear that the aliens also have this ability. And if you can master this language, you can also master time. Just a brilliant story. And he's a great writer anyway, but the idea itself was just great. So in Sharakai, only certain people have the ability to use blood magic, and so you literally feed on somebody else's blood. You can get some power from your own, but you get more power from other people's blood. And they're not vampiric exactly. Typically, it's sort of given from allies or something like this. And once they have that power, they have to use it in some way, and they use it by creating these sigils, and they can draw them, which helps their state of mind, but they can also visualize it. And so I do things like adding hidden and reveal, to find people that are hidden, or doorways that are hidden, or fire and project to, blast some flame or whatever. And they have to control it carefully, so that if they don't use that in the right way, that it might get blowback, on them. And so it's just more more rule based than otherwise. And then there's lots of magic that revolves around the kings. I have lots of like artifacts that they were given. The Asiram that I mentioned earlier, they live out in the desert. There was this grand ring of trees called Adhikara trees, which is called they're called the blooming fields. And the Asiram live under those trees, and that's where the people that they take, the tributes, are taken and they are thrown to the trees, and the trees like envelop them with spines and sort of strangle them and pull them down into the earth and feast on them essentially. And so that's there's a bunch of magic that's kind of derived from those particular trees. And so I really do enjoy the sort of like herbalism, and using plants with toxins for poisons and other like beneficial effects and stuff. And so that's maybe a third type of magic that is common, and not just the trees. There's other plants that have cool effects that come into play. So I do like it when I have magic systems. I like having more than one. 'Cause I feel like if there's magic, there's probably different sources or different ways that it's utilized, and that sort of thing.
Yeah, yeah. The world building in your books is fantastic. Just, from talking tonight, and you just touched on some of it. There's so much there. It's one of the things that I like so much about them is that you scrape the surface and there's something else, and then you go into another part of the world and another character and another story, and there's something else going on, and it's just layer upon layer, and it makes it feel real and it makes it feel lived in. Some books you read, you step left instead of right, and it feels like there's nothing on the page. Like you could just be like, well, I don't know, because the world doesn't hang together. It doesn't feel like it, but you built it on that structure, as you said, that initial pyramid, and then it was all developed from there, and it's clear. It makes sense to me.
Yeah, yeah. It reminds me of I went to a convention a long time ago, and Harry Turtledove was on a panel, and um, I think it was about a question I asked, but he said, you want a story that feels like it lives beyond the pages.
Yeah.
And that's what I've always tried to do, and that's why I spend so much time. I mean, I enjoy it, and I feel it's necessary, but I think it also helps make the world feel like it is a real place, because you'll be spending more time on the world than you will make up more things than will actually appear in the story.
Yes.
And that's a good thing, because it does, when you feel like there's an alley that takes a left, you want to feel like that actually goes somewhere, and it's not just gray space beyond what you can see, right?
Yeah.
So that's part of it. One other thing I'll mention, because I enjoy this. One other thing I added, so I have the Asirim, which are these sort of ghoul, Eddie from Iron Maiden type creatures, but there are I like the jinn from Sufi Arabic culture, and the Ifrit, other creatures. So like the kind of one of the main ones that I have in the story are Erek, which are jinn-like creatures. They're sort of demons, very powerful, and they were created by some of the young gods, especially Gojin, the dark god in the story, and so they play a part too. So I like the idea that in hidden corners of this desert, there are creatures that have been undiscovered for hundreds of years, and if you just go there, you will find them, maybe to your dismay, type thing. I enjoy world building a lot, making sure it does feel like a lived-in place.
It definitely shows. Absolutely. Just a little quick question about the kind of business side, because it's a 6-book series. So did you initially sell it as a trilogy, and then if that went well, then said, right, well then do, because nowadays long running series are fairly uncommon, and even if they are picked up, it's not usual to take the whole thing out of the gate. So how was it with yours?
Yeah, we sold. So I had envisioned this as 5 initially, and I think my agent said, well, we'll just we're not going to sell 5 anyway, so we'll sell 3. We'll pitch it as a trilogy. So that's what we sold, was 3 early on, and then by the time I was done with the first book, it had the content. I realized must be 2 books, so it became 6 books at that point. Part of the reason that happened, just as a small bit of trivia, I started writing the series with the express goal of writing an epic fantasy from a single POV. And that's what Jada was the main POV, and I wrote the first draft was only her. There were no other POV. And by the time I was nearing the end of the first draft, I knew I had to open it up, because I was starting to go through all sorts of contortions to try to get the reader information through her point of view. And it started to feel unnatural, both unnatural, and the reader didn't have enough to really understand what was going on in this, fairly big epic storyline. By then I had introduced King Hassan, who was sort of a trickster type character. And so he's one of the kings, he's very powerful, but he has an agenda that perhaps goes against what the other kings might want. And then I have these 4 kingdoms around the desert, who have coveted the city of Sharakai because it is so powerful in terms of trade between these four countries. And so they have been watching Sharakai's decline. Sharakai has been weakening slightly over time, and so they're ready to pounce. And so this is more of that like world on the brink of change type thing I was talking about earlier. And so I needed some people to represent them, these other kingdoms. And so Ramad Amansir is a lord from the southern kingdom, and he's in the desert for revenge, in essence. He's after somebody who killed his wife and daughter. And so so he's there. And then Cheetah's best friend to represent one other element, which is the Moonless Host. The Moonless Host are a group who are bent on the destruction of the kings. They want to bring the kings down. They are part of and associated with the slums, the west end of the city, who have been hit hardest over the centuries by the kings. You know, it is dirt poor, and somewhat because those people like are largely immigrants from the desert. That's where usually people who emigrate to the city live. And so naturally it's kind of a hotbed for a resistance, you know, of some sort. And so I needed someone to represent them, and that became Emery, Cheetah's best friend, someone she lives with in the beginning of the story. And so, yeah, so that complicated the story. That's why that first book had to become two. It was just getting too long. And so I found a reasonably good stopping point at the end of the first one, and it just continued on.
And now book 6, A Desert Torn Asunder, comes out July 13th. Wraps it all up. Have you got
copies?
Excellent. Look at that. Awesome. Lovely.
Yeah, the artist Micah Epstein did a great job. He came in on starting the 4th book, so he's done the 4th, 5th, and 6th covers. Mm-hmm. They're just awesome, I think. So yeah, really happy with it.
Are you happy with how it's all wrapped up? You got to the end of that 6th book. I found on the end of my last series, I had to kind of keep checking that I covered most of the stuff there, and the book got longer and longer as I realized I wrapped up things. How were you with tying up, without spoilers, tying things up?
Yeah, that comment reminds me of I joined Masterclass for a year, as it was actually a birthday gift, and I watched Dan Brown, his masterclass on writing thrillers.
Yeah,
and it was actually, I watched a number of them, and his was actually the most useful to me anyway. The others on there were quite good, but one of the things that he mentioned was one of the things that you're doing, especially early in a novel, is making promises. You are making promises to readers that you will answer the questions that you're posing in the beginning of the novel. And so, as time goes on, as new characters and twists are introduced with agendas of their own, you will have to answer those things. So in my story, I'm posing questions like, what do the kings want? What are they hiding? What did they do to gain their power over the Asirim and the city? Who are the Asirim? And what is their relationship to Cheetah and her mother? What are the gods up to? Why did they make the bargain with the kings in the first place? Right? What would motivate them to do that? And so those are just a few examples of some of the questions that I need to answer by the end of the whole series. And I had 6 books to do it, so I had plenty of space to do that. And of course, each book I feel wraps up, pretty well. It is an arc of its own. But because I had things so clear in my mind from the beginning, I knew where things were headed before I started writing the first book. Again, not the actual incarnation. I didn't know what the characters would be like or the angle they came at to that finale. But I knew how things were going to wrap up. And it was, I feel like it wrapped up really well. I hope readers are, I was super satisfied with finishing that first draft. And then on the first, after I write a book, I call that the 0th draft. In other words, the very first draft I call 0th draft because it's so rough. There's so many things that have sort of changed over the course of things. And I almost never go back and rewrite as I'm writing. In other words, if I in midway, if I find an idea for chapter 1 or chapter 2, I will not go back and rewrite that. I'll just take a note and move on, unless it affects the plot in some great way. Then I will go change it. But generally speaking, I don't. So I'll finish it, and then rewrite it and then set it aside for a while. So by the time I came back, towards the end of the editing cycle, and things were pretty solid. Just as a reader, as a fan of my own world and these characters and stuff, and suffering through their angst and their pain over the course of 6 books, I just felt this big release at the end. And I hope readers agree, but I personally was very satisfied with how things turned out, and I think I've fulfilled all my promises. And obviously not everything was wrapped up in a neat bow.
No.
There are always some sort of twists and complications. I hope, at least that's what I shoot for. And because that's life, nothing is going to be perfect. And so, it's not super clean for everybody, but it resolves, I think, in a satisfying way. So yeah, it felt really good. And I mentioned the Asiram. So one of the things we find early on is that the gods, when they made the bargain with the kings, they gave each of the kings a power. They also gave each of the kings a unique weakness, and they encapsulated those in an epic poem. And so, once they had agreed, one of the gods sort of relayed this to the kings. And so we find that out. We don't know what the poem is because the kings are nervous about that. They don't want their weaknesses to be revealed, and so they stifle that information. They make it punishable by death to repeat it, and even the knowledge that those things exist. They purged all writings, if there were any. And so over time, that just became lost. People just didn't realize that existed, that epic poem. And so that poem I actually wrote in full for all of the kings before page 1. Like, I wanted that to be one of the things that was one engine of the story, and so early on, that's like one of the things that Shada is after. She learns about those poems because her mother left her a book of poems, and hidden within the pages are those others' secrets. And so she finds those, and then she wants to find more, naturally, so she can bring down the kings for killing her mother. And so I knew, early on, that I was going to put that into the final book. And so that is the last chapter of the book, is just that big poem.
Excellent.
That was just cool, to be honest. I mean, I don't know whether or not I'm a great poet, but I really liked reading the whole book, reading the ending, and the denouement and stuff, and then reading that poem. And readers get bits and pieces of it and stuff, but in full, it just felt like a cool capstone, to the whole series.
Yeah, especially since you've had it from the very beginning, constantly in the back of your mind. We've been getting glimpses of it all the way through the story. Nice to have it there right at the end. And of course, you've done novellas in between as well. And as you said, you haven't wrapped up everything. So maybe there's room to do some novellas in the future. Who knows?
Yeah, I'm not tackling this right away, but I have a trilogy in mind for some of the, let's say, survivors of this first arc. I don't think it would be longer than a trilogy, but I know specifically which characters will be involved, and they will be quite young, right in the telling of the current novels, and they will have aged up. So this will be some number of years later. And I have an inkling of what the story looks like. So I think I will come back to this universe, but I need a break for a while. I got to get away and do some other stuff.
Oh yeah, you definitely. Well, I've got books on my to read, pal. Some of yours right there. You see, they're right there. I've got books 4 and 5. I think it's 6 is not out yet, so it's to come, but it's on my to read, pal. So I'm looking forward to seeing how the story wraps up and seeing how it develops for me. But thanks for coming on tonight. Thanks for talking to us and sharing your stories about how you got published and your books. And good luck for the publication of book 6.
Yeah, thank you, and thanks for having me by. It's always fun to talk with fellow writers and to dig into craft and such. So yeah, it was a fun time.
All right, guys. See you later.
Bye-bye.